Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm your host, Arundhati, and today I get to speak to two amazing women, Tejal and Jesal, from the Yoga is Dead podcast. I'm pretty sure you already know who they are, but just in case you haven't, you've got to go check out their Yoga is Dead podcast. It's one of the podcasts that really shook the yoga industry in 2019, and these conversations were so strong and powerful and really relevant to our times. I had a fun time catching up with both of them. They've been big inspirations to me starting this podcast. They've always been supportive, and it's like a full circle moment for me to have them on the podcast. I almost ran out of time. I wish I could talk to them for like 3 hours more and go through all the questions I wanted to ask them, but I'll bring them back on soon. And the only thing we didn't get to in this interview was they're doing follow up conversations about each episode. And these are happening live in the month of September. In case you're listening to this in September, make sure to check out our show notes as well as the Yoga is Dead handle for more information on how you can participate in these events. Enjoy this interview. I'll see you on the other side. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a six-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Tejal and Jesal. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm so excited that you agreed to do this today. How are you both?
I'm doing good.
Doing well. Yeah.
I'm so excited. I want you to know that this is like a fangirl interview that we're doing today because I love the Yoga is Dead podcast and I'm so glad you did it. For anyone listening who doesn't know, in 2019, you launched a podcast called Yoga is Dead, which took a very unique, bold stand as to what yoga has become in the modern world. And it was something that honestly we hadn't heard in a very long time. And these were conversations that were never had openly. I'm curious as to what led to the creation of this podcast. Tejal, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, sure. I like that you say that it's something we had never heard because I think these conversations were happening but behind closed doors and in certain circles, but I don't think it had come to the forefront but ever by two South Asian yoga instructors before. So that's something that was different about our podcast for sure. And then you're right, it was really unique and bold in the statement of it. But what really led us to think about developing a podcast was this experience that we had together, which was when we first met in 2015. And we had a series of jarring experiences, I would say, at white woman run yoga studio. And the combination of feeling like we were being gaslit, having really unclear onboarding practices as to how our karma yoga classes were being used towards getting a job, having unclear scheduling and pay structures communicated to us, all of those experiences actually started off on what we felt was very uncomfortable about the yoga world, what just felt really uncomfortable to us in our bodies and in our identities in the yoga world. And then through that, we actually didn't stay at the studio. I stayed at the studio, or I guess I would say we didn't do the same thing after we met at that studio. I stayed and Jesal left, and then the next 3 years, we were simply colleagues, just keeping up with each other, supporting each other. And then it wasn't until 2018 where Jesal joined a weekend yoga retreat I was hosting. And I said to her at lunch, have you ever thought about doing a podcast? And have you ever thought about doing a podcast with me? Here's my pitch, basically. And then the conversation became, I have no idea what that is. Me neither. And we kept talking, and we revamped the premise, and we kept talking. And after a while, a year and a half, we came out with Yoga is Dead.
Who thought of that title? Was it Jesal or was it you, Tejal?
We did that exercise where we wrote down a bunch of names and we kept talking about the feel that we wanted. And we played around with these allusions towards what we were trying to say, like the yoga shade or yoga under the mat or monsters under the mat. But eventually we were like, we just need to say what we need to say. And I think it might have been you, Jesal. I don't know, but we got to this
I
point.
think it was you, though, but I think you said it, but I think it was in my subconscious already because I swear to God, a month after you said that name, I had looked through my notebooks and I found that phrase in my notebook. So I'm like, you might have been the one to like actually say it, but I feel like we were both already thinking it. So, you know.
Well, I'm so glad.
Yeah, it was part of our universal consciousness of what we were talking about, I think. And then we started playing with the imagery, and we had like all these interesting conversations around what does that look like when you say yoga is dead. And we had these wilted rose imagery, and we had like a skull hand, just a skeleton hand imagery. And what came out was Miss Yoga is Dead, which is just this bold, sassy South Asian woman about to practice yoga, and she still has that skull ring on her finger, and she has that basically RBF, this resting bitch face going on.
No, that's great.
So it all came together really well, but it took us a while to solidify and stamp it and be like, okay, just say what you want, what we need to say, which is yoga is dead.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great. Jesal, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just agree with everything Tejal said, and that was it. Our consciousness is in the same place. What Tejal is, I think, saying, and I'll just re-express, is that it was like, for us, we have to get really clear on what's our overall message. And that's why it took us a year and a half, right? Because we started out with like a couple of disparate stories, like things that had happened to us, but we couldn't really like figure out the theme. It took us a year and a half to really figure out like, what is this whole thing under? Like, what is the overarching umbrella of the conversation? Like, what is this experience we're having in every facet of the industry, right? Because the first one is obviously about racism, but then we talk about employment practices and this, that, and it's like, oh, yoga is dead. That's what we're trying to say as millennials, you know? Not in a serious way, but in like that, like she just said, that sarcastic way.
Oh, I love it. I mean, I remember the first time I heard about your podcast was on some random Facebook group. Somebody had said, "What's your favorite yoga podcast?" And there were a couple of people who said yoga is dead. And I'm a podcast junkie and I'm like, wait, how have I not listened to that yet? And I just, quickly grabbed my phone and looked for it and just said, I didn't even read what was, I just hit play. And then I'm like, Jesal and Tejal, wait a minute. Like, wow, what is this?
Indian names.
Yeah, and that's when I remember I actually stopped what I was doing and I was listening, and that's how I got hooked onto it. For anyone who hasn't listened to the podcast, it has season 1 is done. It has 6 amazing episodes. But I'm curious, what was the hardest episode or what was the most challenging episode for you to put together? And do both of you have a favorite? Jaisal, do you want to take this one?
Sure. For me, the hardest I think was the Guru's episode because it was just such like depressing and like deep and dark material that it was very challenging. And actually one of the things you'll hear in the episode edit, and this is before we got better at editing too, was I am like nervous laughing the entire time because it's not laughter, it's me being just like so nervous talking about this subject because it's so challenging, and I like it just puts you in a dark place. And to have written about it, like a lot of people think we just get on the mic and talk. We actually write scripts. And so we had been writing about this for weeks before even recording. So you can just imagine the energy and us like trying to like bolster ourselves up to even talk about it, in the studio. So that's kind of the energy of that one was just so challenging. And in terms of like actual editing, I think all of them were hard. Like it being our first time doing anything like this, we ended up somehow miraculously coming up with this great structure for the first episode. What we completely forgot to do was apply that same structure for all the rest of the episodes, and we ended up going back and re-recording and punching in, and then eventually by the like third episode we just rewrote the entire script. So we had to like record some of these episodes twice because we just got better at it, right? As we were doing it, and had to like, and then we realized we didn't want the quality to suffer. So we just ended up doing it twice. So it was overall just a challenging experience. It was a great experience, but yeah, that Guru's episode really got me. And if I think of a favorite, I don't know. It's hard for me to say because on the one hand, the first episode was really great. It was like new. Do you know what I mean? It was like a very new experience and us being so excited, and like those stories were so personal. And then on the other hand, by the time we got to the end, I feel like we really had a flow. So those two are kind of my favorites for different reasons.
Okay. Tejal, what about you?
So I have different ways to look at favorite and hardest. So episode 3, Gurus, was definitely the hardest. I think post recording was the hardest because I have a tendency to work until we get to that point. So I wasn't necessarily focused on how it was making me feel, which whether or not that's a good thing, take it or leave it, but that's what happened. And then after we sat for 8 hours, because we recorded for 8 hours a day for season 1. Yeah, we would start in the morning, we'd go for lunch, and we'd come back for our afternoon session. So we even had like mini breakouts during the day to talk about how things were going. After we finished that day of recording, we sat in the car to go home, and it was like a heavy fog was in the car with us. And it just felt like that fog was like laying on top of us, and we couldn't get out of that car fast enough. And I know I was closer to the recording studio, so I got out right away. And then I knew Jesal was in the car because I could track her ride. I knew she was in the car for another like 40 minutes, and I was just thinking about her because even the things we didn't say in the podcast, because we edit a lot. We have a lot of storytelling, and then we choose what's the most salient. Even the things we didn't bring up, but we had talked about between us and had recorded, but we knew wasn't gonna make it in the episodes. That was just sitting there in that fog, and it takes a while, like somatically, for your body to recover from that. So that was the most challenging to de-stress from. I think the most challenging, to deal with the impact was episode 4, Vegans Killed Yoga. That was a very interesting audience response. And I won't even say audience because it wasn't necessarily all listeners that attacked us for that episode, that felt personally attacked for that episode. But I would just call it this onslaught of response regarding our social media for that episode. And it was probably a culmination of us gaining social media traction by then. But the majority of the response were from people that were really fanatical about their veganism and were taking that out on us as individuals. That was a really interesting, eye-opening situation for me because I just had not experienced that before on social media, for one, and from people about their beliefs, thinking that I was personally attacking them. I had never experienced that before. Yeah, and then I will just say that one of the more challenging ones for me to put together was episode 2, Karma Capitalism Killed Yoga, because again, that one had a lot of storytelling going into it. So there was a lot of context, and there was, like years of experience to fit into an hour episode. And an hour episode is actually really long to sit and listen to, but the amount of information we had intended to put into that was really challenging for me to distill and say, this is most relevant to what our purpose is for this episode. So it brought up a lot for me, the episode 2, Karma Capitalism. And then going through that, it was something I was also living in, some of those experiences at the moment. And that felt really real and relevant and actually very raw for me.
I would have never guessed that you would have gotten most pushback on the vegans episode. For me, I thought it would be White Women Killed Yoga episode 1. I'm actually surprised to hear that it was the vegans episode that you had to get most pushback. How do you ladies deal with, when you get like hate mail and everybody say, different differences of opinion? Do you have human reactions like the rest of us, or do you manage to actually pull out some yamas and niyamas in dealing with this? Who wants to go first, Tejal or Jesal? Jesal, why don't you take this one?
I'll go and I'll speak to it because I had a different headspace going into this episode. I knew we were going to get this kind of hate.
Oh,
And
okay.
Tejal didn't expect it. So she just spoke to that, right? Like how she had no idea that was coming. I knew this was coming. Um, and it's probably because, like I wrote about food for fun like before, and I like had encountered these communities, and I knew that there is I don't want to generalize and say all vegans are fanatical because they're not. That's not true, but there is definitely a very loud, very aggressive faction amongst vegans who are fanatical and will come after you if you say anything negative. And so I expected it from the get-go. So that was my headspace going in. And in preparation, like one of our listeners had offered to do a distance Reiki session. And I actually had set that up for like 2 days after the episode was coming out because I knew. Not that I made it any better, but I just had that like internal preparation. I think part of our going through this iterative process of like getting feedback on our episodes, we've had to get really clear on what kind of feedback we accept and don't accept, right? And so a couple of guidelines we use is the person who's coming to us of a more marginalized experience? If so, okay, we need to listen to that feedback. Is the person coming to us, what are some of I forget some of the filters, but we have some filters I need to refine again around like how we accept feedback, right? And what I don't do is accept all feedback anymore just because somebody has something to say. Right. And it's like if you're more privileged, if you're coming from a place of lack of understanding, if you didn't even listen to the episode, I'm not taking your feedback in. Right. So I have that level of discernment now. And I know Tejal does too, because you just, people are just going to say what they want to say. And they're not necessarily even going to have all the facts. And you can't be bothered with people that don't have all the facts. It might still get to you a little bit, but you can create this barrier between like, okay, I'm going to listen to you. I'm not going to listen to you. Here's why. Right. So that we do have that like bit of, I guess you could say we're applying some of that yogic philosophy now into how we try to internalize or not internalize feedback. And you do get more detached and you tend to hear the same things over and over again. And I think here's the weird thing about doing this in such a public setting and in a time of social media. Instagram's algorithm thrives on negative feedback because it's organic comments. Yeah, it drives organic comments. What's going to get somebody who's okay? The best thing you can have for your account is somebody who's not following you come to your page over and over again and leave long comments.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's the best thing for you, right? To get visibility. How is that going to be generated? Through hate, not through appreciation.
Through controversy. Yeah.
Right? Controversy. Through somebody disagreeing with you vehemently. That's the only way that's going to be generated organically. And so this type of controversy is really good for your social media, but it's really bad for your soul. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
So those two things are at odds with each other. And I am constantly like trying to find this balance of like, and I know Tejal and I obviously have these conversations all the time. What's censoring? So what's free speech? What's censoring? What's real feedback? What's just like difference of opinion, ignorance, hate? And then what's good for visibility? And at what point do you cut off no matter what? Because it's just affecting your soul.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Yeah.
So those are all considerations that we take into account when we're dealing with comments and feedback. So there's no straightforward answer, but you kind of have to create these processes for yourself.
No, that's great. I actually think it's really important to know who do you take feedback from. That's something I hadn't thought of, and I think it's really important that you brought that up. Tejal, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add that it's not a hard and fast rule every time you apply it. Because if you say, "Oh, well, I only take feedback from yoga teachers," that's still not going to be safe in any way, because there are a myriad of different yoga styles of yoga teachers out there, and they're personalities behind it as well. And, people don't like to say it, but political mindsets around yoga as well. So I think that's really interesting in terms of how you apply your guidelines. It does take critical thinking each time as to who you're listening to and who you might disregard. And then also just knowing how the system works. There are people that exist solely on social media to attack other people. And they don't have a profile on their own. They don't have any kind of platform where they're talking about their opinion in any way on their own, but they exist just to call other people out. So in terms of you mentioned having a human response to it. Yeah, I still very much have a human response to it, but I also have a logical approach to it. Is this person intentionally trying to create harm, or is this person on the other side of things trying to have a conversation? And I hate to say it, but very rarely on social media are people coming to large platforms to have conversations. They're coming to attack. And I think you just have to be discerning about that.
I just want to add, because I remembered something through what Tejal just said too, was one of our criteria is like, are you in the arena, right? What she's talking about is the opposite of being in the arena, like trolls, essentially, people who don't have profiles, who don't have followers, aren't even public, and they just have like a blank account to go and attack, right? Versus like, I'm much more receptive to feedback if somebody else is willing to be public and to put themselves out there, put their own work out there, because that means you know what it's like to be vulnerable. It goes back to Brene Brown, I think, talks about this, right? Like, are you willing to be vulnerable? If you know what it's like to be vulnerable, then I'll probably listening to you because I'm being vulnerable right now. But if you're not going to be vulnerable, then you have no idea what it feels like.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it happens more often than most people know. I mean, especially in the yoga world, right? Where everybody thinks, all of us who teach yoga, we live the practice, we're kind to each other. But there are people who are out there trolling nonstop online. And I want to go back to a couple of things both of you brought up in your conversations. One question would be, should yoga teachers teach for free? Because you were talking about the karma capitalism episode. So I guess I'm trying to say or ask, should yoga teachers be teaching for free? If yes, who should they be teaching for free? And I'm going to give this to you first, Tejal, because I think you brought it up.
Mm. I don't think that, again, that there's a rule to that. I don't think yes, yoga teachers should work for free, and no, yoga teachers shouldn't work for free. I think there is a sliding scale, no pun intended, on how a yoga teacher offers their services. And, what I will say though about that is, in terms of charging for your services, whenever possible, have your pricing be accessible. I think that to me has become so clear in how yoga needs to be offered. On the one hand, we live in a world where we have bills to pay, and our choices might lead us to teach yoga as our careers. If that's the case, you have bills to pay. You need to pay your bills by charging people for yoga. Does that mean every class should cost $50 per entrance? No. But can you find a way to make accessible pricing so that you can meet people where they're at, which is essentially how we're supposed to teach yoga, meet the individual where they're at. And in my personal practice as a teacher, what I've started to notice is the invitation to allow people to name their price can be a very interesting thought exercise and practical exercise. It requires a discernment on the role of the student to actually sit in the seat of assessment. Where do I live right now? Where do I need my practice right now? What do I want to commit to? And I've had conversations with students where they've approached me and said, I'm usually going to a donation-based studio, so can you give me donation-based classes? And my response is, I can give you the pricing that you need. Name your price. And I'd prefer you to get a 5-pack or a 10-pack because I want you to get comfortable with the practice or maybe make a habit from it. My recommendation is try to build a habit. And then if you don't stay with my practice, that's fine, but maybe you've built a healthy practice for yourself, because that's just what I feel will bring some of those added benefits of yoga to your life: focus, clarity, and strengthen your swadhyaya. So that's an interesting practice I've started to offer to people: is how can you reciprocate what you're asking from me from your lens and from your point of view? Because all the factors that make up whatever your pricing needs are, I can't presume to know all of them. So let's do this together. Let's create relationship from the start together. So I really would say, to the should or should not question, I am starting to feel really strongly that pricing just needs to be accessible. And that can be creative based on the location that you're in, based on the communities that you want to serve. But pricing needs to be accessible.
And before Jesal jumps in, I just want to add a little more context. I think why I was asking this is, as a studio owner, I feel like sometimes yoga studio owners take advantage of new teachers or even experienced teachers and end up making people teach for free, whether that is in the name of karma yoga for the studio, which I completely disagree with. You can't trade free work for work study. At least legally, I can't up here in Washington state. So it was interesting during the pandemic when it started. A lot of teachers were expected or were requested to teach online for free for a yoga studio. I mean, some did, some didn't, but I made it very clear to my teachers that if I can afford to pay them and their Wi-Fi connection is good enough to stream classes and stuff, yes, we'll do it. If not, until a point where we get to that where we can give them classes again, I will take the load. I will work to teach all the classes to make ends meet. I think that's why I was bringing it up.
And I'll add to that, because post pandemic, after the shutdown, I was in a similar situation. And instead of being told, like, let's do this ongoing for as long as possible, it was like, let's do this for a fixed period of time on a donation basis. And the donations will be split with the teaching team until you feel that it's no longer like equitable for your time and energy. Because people don't necessarily put all the building blocks together of what it takes to teach, right? You hear this all the time. Well, this practice comes from your heart. If you're doing what you love, if you're doing this spiritual practice, why would you charge for it? Or this type of practice is seva, so you should not be charging for it. And again, that should or should not, I don't think applies here. But in that experience that I lived through, we had to arrange our space in order to offer a recorded class in a quiet space that was any kind of quality class, right? And after a few weeks, the pandemic, like, craze, I guess, died down a little bit, and you could see that donations were dropping off. And up to a certain point, it was fine. But then after a certain point, it was not fine, because it no longer felt that the effort put into offering that class, planning that class, preparing space for that class was then a reciprocal offering. So I appreciate that you were able to be clear about that up front, because many teachers say, well, I don't feel like I can say no, because what else am I doing then? And I just don't think that this work is meant to take from the person, right? If you're offering it for free, you shouldn't at the same time feel like your energy is being taken from you and that you don't have much left to give, like you're drained. It should at least be energy neutral or energy activating.
True. Jesal, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, this is such a big topic, but I think that one of the things we said from the episode that it applies here, which is that nobody can dictate to you what your karma should be, your selfless service, right? So as a teacher, we have to be really discerning if we are feeling pressured to offer things for free, even though it doesn't feel, like they just said, energy neutral or energy activating. And I don't think it, like, in the end, if the business model, if the capitalistic piece of this puzzle is feeling like it's doing more harm to the staff than good for the community, then that needs to be reevaluated. Like, is that a worthwhile enterprise to keep going down the path of, because so much harm is being done in the name of good? Ultimately, that can't happen. There needs to be good happening in the name of good. Everything needs to be good. It can't just be like, oh, the staff feels hurt and harmed and unable to survive, but hey, we're serving this population, right? Like that's just at odds. So we need to be very clear that everybody needs to feel helped and everybody needs to feel good in the process, even under the guise of capitalism. And then I think community plays such a big role in this. Like if we are relational, we can have these conversations in a much better way versus like I think what oftentimes happens in these like studio teacher or even teacher student relationships is there's a power hierarchy and we're not addressing that power hierarchy versus like if this felt like community, this felt like a safe space for us to be relational and have a back and forth, then everybody can get what they need and we can become more clear on who it is that we're serving. So I'll give you an example. Like I'm doing a series with Lakshmi Nair and Susanna Barkataki, right? And as part of that, we're offering some scholarships. And we're very clear, like what we need in order to make this energetically at least neutral for us, right? And we're also very clear on who we're trying to serve and how we're able to offer scholarships to those who need it. Like, how are we able to build in accessibility? We're also using some community crowdfunding in order to help us offer more scholarships than we would be able to normally. And then one person emailed us and asked us about discounts. And it's very interesting because we were very clear, like, we're actually offering accessible pricing. If you need it, we'll make it happen. But if you don't need it, but you're still asking for a discount, like what is that saying? That you don't value us? Or that even though you don't need it, you still want to pay less? Right? Like we're saying like this, we carefully curated this pricing structure to make it energetically neutral for all of us and to make it worthwhile for all of us in this together. And to ask for discounts just feels like you're undermining our value.
Absolutely. I think it comes down to like up here in Redmond, I have a lot of people who in the past would just email me and say, "Oh, I work at Microsoft. Do you have an employee discount?" And I would just and it's a request we've gotten often, not a request, it's a question we've gotten often. And I'd be like, "No, we do not have a special discount for Microsoft employees." I mean, it's just I get a lot of these discount emails, free class to try, and it bothers me quite a bit because I'm like, hey, I'm a small business and you're not. And you can completely afford to pay me $15-20 for a class. But I have people who say, oh, okay, let me know when you run a community class and I'll come for that, when they honestly don't need it. So, what I'm trying to say is, studios like me, I've kind of shut down to being open about discounts and free classes because of a certain type of clientele that I'm exposed to often. And that's sad because it disadvantages other people who may or may not have access to the studio. So yeah, it's just something that came to my mind.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify that as people in the middle of all this, I think it's our job then to get really clear and to educate people like, hey, you're actually coming from this economic privilege, right? And these other people are not. And so your economic privilege is being shared in a spiritual way. And if you're not okay with it, then that's fine. This is probably not the space for you. You know what I mean? Like just to be very clear around like where the privileges are and where they're going. They're helping to fund the people that don't have as much economic privilege.
Most of my clientele are IT employees, honestly, with like really comfortable incomes. And when the pandemic started, I got this is the last story I'm going to tell you and then move on. When the pandemic started, I got this email from a Starbucks employee who wrote to me and said, I assume you will teach these first two classes for free and then we'll take it from there and then we'll see, blah, blah, blah. You'll get like exposure to like 40 people or 400 people or something like that. And I wrote back a pretty scathing reply saying, it's a pandemic, we're closed, we're a small business, and we do not give free classes to corporates who can well afford to pay for our services. And then he wrote back 2 weeks later and said, oh, can we still make this work? And I was like, nope, I'm sorry. Our values don't align. I can't work with you.
Yeah, it's true. It's a value system, right? What are people valuing the spiritual practice with? And I think that's a really strong tell because it shows up in the way that you're educated about the practice too. I think it's all around, well, what do you value the practice based off of? Were you educated that it's meant to be given to you for free, or that people should be giving it to you for free, that they don't have any other needs other than providing you the service for free because it's fills them with love and light, and maybe that's all they need to survive. So I think that's really interesting. We talked a lot about that in the episode in terms of, in the past, the practice was not necessarily offered. It wasn't offered in the way it's offered now. In the East and in the past, it was offered in a completely different way. And if that's the way people are holding on to, the way of the ascetic monk walking around without a home, without property, living in the mountains, quietly offering service to maybe somebody that passed by, or running an ashram with only basic necessities for those that might be willing to donate to stay, if that's the image you're holding on to, it's really dissonant with applying it to someone who has a house and a mortgage and utility bills to pay down the street from you, that will help make the practice convenient for you by being available on a schedule for you. So I find that really interesting. Glad you wrote that email in that way, too.
Yeah, and I had a very human reaction because this was literally at the start of the pandemic and the studio was closed and nobody knew what was going on. And I was like, how do you even do that to somebody else? Like, write and say, teach for free. Would you work for Starbucks for 2 days free? Like, if you wouldn't work for free, why should I?
Well, and that's the thing. I also had a very steady gig with a company who, it was like a building, and they asked me, they didn't realize I was still teaching, and then they realized, like, we had a conversation and they're like, can you do it at a discount? And I was like, why? Are you charging less rent? You're not charging less rent to your tenants, so why should I be paid less for the service I'm offering your tenants?
Yeah, and I think yoga teachers should start voicing this a lot more. And I really think that'll help, especially with yoga transitioning online. Speaking of yoga going online, what are your thoughts about yoga teacher trainings going online? I mean, Asana has been online for a couple of years, maybe more than a couple of years now. But what impact do you think online yoga teacher trainings will have on yoga, say, in the next 5 years or more? Jesal, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have really mixed feelings about it overall because on the one hand, I think the online space offers so many great things, like so many great things. For example, convenience, right? First of all, for me as a teacher, I can now travel without traveling. So from that perspective alone, I'm like, oh, this is great. It offers accessibility to people who would otherwise probably never be able to travel or go to certain studios or certain, offerings because of commute time and childcare and all of those other factors. And so and it also offers a variety of pricing options that we're seeing come up because of this response to online. We're seeing like more of this sliding scale options come up. And we're seeing voices that usually don't get heard because of this online space. And we're able to now find community with the people we really want to find community with, because we're not just dependent on our local neighborhood and who's available to us. So in a way, I think there's so much greatness to be had from this online space. At the same time, I teach oftentimes anatomy in these trainings, and that's a very hard topic to teach online. It's very hard because it's what I rely on is us to be able to see each other in a room and see how differently our bodies move. And so with the camera only angled at a certain, everybody has a different camera angle. You can only see certain parts of your body. It's much harder to go around the room. It's much harder to see how we all do the same thing, but actually ends up being very different in our bodies. It presents a challenge. And so I do think that there is something lost online, but there's so much more gained. So there is mixed feelings there for sure.
Okay. Okay. Tejal?
Yeah, I'm going to just say we've talked about this a little bit, Jesal and I also have mixed feelings, and I'm working through them because how much of this is a necessary response to what's been happening with the shutdown and lockdown? And then when I say that out loud, I think, is it necessary to train more teachers in this time frame? So I go through this whole cycle of thoughts, and then I just go down this path where I can't evaluate everybody's relationship with a studio or a teacher and judge that. So if a studio or a teacher wants to offer a teacher training, it may be because they have existing relationships for years with the people they're offering that training to. It may be because their style of training is already something I don't support or am not interested in. So I don't have I don't think people should or shouldn't on this one. I think that we're losing some of the nuance with not being in person. But if that's the reality that we're living in, don't we need to just accommodate that reality? Or should we just say maybe globally teacher trainings are on hold for a year? I mean, I don't think the wheels would fall off if we did that. But for some reason, that's not the machine that we're operating with. So I just hope that people are taking all the different ways they can get educated, maybe through our podcast, through other types of critical response podcasts, through conversations they're having in their community, and really using that to change the model if they need to better suit their needs and their students' needs. Like for Jesal talking about anatomy training, I know that she's using a lot more visual aids than she might normally because there are no bodies in the room and you have to have a lot more references when you look at a screen, specifically for the work that she's talking about. So plus the whole model of teacher training it's the big question mark that we talk about in our last episode too. Is this even an adequate style to train teachers? So I don't think the answers are all fleshed out yet.
I'll just say, like, I lean towards yes, it's okay versus no, because I'm with Tejal. Like, it's a reality, whether we like it or not. It's more of like, how do we adapt to this reality? How do we make it work for us? You know what I mean? And so I do think that changes need to be made. Like Tejal was saying, I add way more visual aids to make the lesson really sink in, or we really stop and take time to practice and ask questions. And maybe the training needs to be twice as long because of the format. But the point is, it should be adapted. It needs to be adapted. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, adapted and elevated.
And I'll say for Yoga Zed, we actually did double the length of our workshop. We went from 90 to 2 hours to 4 hours. And there's more room for discussion. There's more room to meet with people in breakout format so that you can have these moments of connection instead of people constantly being pounded with information and then having that to think about on their own, which isn't necessarily the right environment to continue to contemplate on the type of work that we do, especially the type of knowledge that yoga offers you.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to just be flexible and keep learning to adapt. I mean, yoga teacher trainings, and Jesal and I were talking about this just a while ago. We can talk about it for hours and hours. I mean, I should have you ladies back on and we should do a separate episode about yoga teacher trainings. But I'm going to ask you one more question before I go back to the Yoga is Dead podcast. Are all yoga teachers made equal? And how should somebody pick a competent yoga teacher? Like if a student's listening and they're looking at options online to pick a yoga teacher, do you have any advice? Tejal, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I think the first advice that I would give to someone looking for a training, that I do give to people looking for a training, is don't necessarily do it the way I did. Live and learn from what people are willing to share with you about their experience and try to learn from that, right? Be the wiser man. And what I would say to people is start your relationship just by talking to someone, not by making the transaction, not by booking in to a teacher training. And how you can do that is by making small investments to get to know somebody. So if you're interested in joining someone's teacher training, scale it back quite a bit. Maybe send a get to know you email. Maybe drop into the next offering that they have and then email them and say, hey, I'm going to be in your next class. I'd really love to talk to you about the training. You'll know if a person is genuinely interested in having a conversation with you based on how they interact with you from that point. If someone needs a $3,000 commitment to have a conversation with you, I think that's a huge tell in what kind of relationship you can expect to have and if that meets your expectations going in. I've talked to a lot of people that have gone through the international trips for yoga teacher trainings. They've gone to Bali or they've gone to like exotic places that essentially sell exotic practices, which, I'm starting to have a bigger problem with. I understand people need vacations, but I don't necessarily understand leaving your whole life to go and get trained on something that then doesn't translate when you come back. Right? How much harder is that then to integrate for you? But the people that I've spoken to that have done this essentially call their yoga teachers yoga celebrities, which means they're at the level of celebrity that they cannot have contact with them ongoing afterwards. And it just leaves you hanging for the most part. So I think what we talk about in the podcast is everybody has responsibility here. From three lenses, we talk about the business or organization owner, we talk about the yoga teacher, and we talk about the yoga student. So even if you feel like you don't have responsibility and you want to give that power and responsibility to your teacher, we urge you to remember that as a student, you have a lot of power and you have a lot of responsibility to yourself to think about the type of training experience you want to have and then vet it out for yourself to see if it feels right before dropping thousands of dollars to do that. Because we've heard all of those horror stories, right?
So true. So true. Before Jesal jumps in, I just want to quickly add something here. In at least my local yoga teacher trainings, I've found that often I chase my students to like practice and commit before the training starts. Like I'm reminding them, like, come do classes with me. It's really important to see if, we align with how we approach yoga, because I may not be the teacher for you. And a lot of students come and do classes, but there are some who just, pay me that $3,000 and show up on the day of the training. And to be honest, I'm nervous for them and I check in 2 weeks later saying, is this what you expected? Because I understand that, I'm not everybody's teacher. And I respect that if you want to move on to something else, because how can you just pay a big chunk of amount and not even try a class, especially online, now that it's so easy? It's just, anyway, something that I wanted to bring up. Jesal, you want to add to that?
Yeah, and your first part of the question made me really like go into this deep thought about myself as a teacher and my own evolution, right? Because you're talking about the different kinds of teachers, and I'm thinking, oh, who was I when I first started teaching versus who am I now over a decade later? Like, very different person, a very different teacher. And even to the point that like my students have commented, the ones that have been with me a long time, even in the last few years, they're like, yeah, when we first started teaching, you were teaching like this, and now they'll even say, I love the classes so much more because of XYZ. So there is this evolution. I'll say, like, as a general rule of thumb, and this is broad generalization, so let's take that with a grain of salt, but like most teachers out of the gate are looking for concrete answers to feel comfortable, right? So we're looking for that, like, I'm doing it right validation as opposed to I'm doing it wrong. And so you tend to teach from that lens if you're looking for that type of validation. Like, you teach it in a binary way. Like, one thing is right and one thing is wrong. Yes and no. And to my own evolution, I'll speak, like, it's become less and less of that. I find that as I've grown as a teacher, I don't need to have right and wrong answers anymore. I don't even have to have any answers. All I have to do is guide and experience, right? Because I feel much more comfortable. I feel like validated within myself. I don't need somebody to feel validated. I'm not seeking external validation anymore. So I think in that sense, like, that's how we can recognize teachers who are a little bit more experienced, I'll say, ones that don't necessarily need the right and wrong, that don't need that external validation, that are just willing to create a container for a space and let you figure it out for yourself with some help if you need. Like, not saying we're leaving our students hanging or anything like that, but just like, I've created the container. If the container's not fitting you, I'm going to step in and make sure the container is fitting you, right? Yeah. And that's how we can decide from the beginning. And I don't think there's anything wrong with taking classes from the yes no teacher either. It's just like, let's know that if, like, there's a difference. There is a difference in what you're going to get. And that difference might even suit you as a student in terms of like what you're ready for, you know?
So true. I'll give you a quick example of this. As a teacher, right? I always share with my trainees that every year I do this, I get better at it. So they literally get lifelong membership into teacher trainings without having to ever pay again. The only condition is they have to complete the training and all the requirements of that year. But say they didn't understand a chapter on restorative yoga, they can always come back anytime in another training and sit through it and go over it again, because they're constantly growing. I'm growing. The way I communicate gets better. The way they understand gets better. So I think we just need to recognize, right, that teachers and students, we're on the same journey. We're all learning. We're all getting
We're
better.
all students.
Yeah.
And
And
if your teacher has stopped being a student, that's a big red flag too.
so true. So true. And I
This
just feel like,
reminds me of, can I just tell you a story what this reminds me of when I was first like minted as a yoga teacher?
absolutely.
I think we probably all were given this advice, and I'm going to talk about it more outside of this, but the worst advice you could ever give a new yoga teacher is go teach everywhere and to anyone. And I've been thinking about that advice, and it's seemingly good advice. Go get experience, right? But 200-hour trained yoga teacher has such limited exposure to teaching different bodies, to teaching different experience levels, to teaching to different conditions, maybe even emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And I think it's actually pretty harmful advice to give to a new yoga teacher because it also gives them false hope that they can teach adequately to anybody that walks in the door. And it doesn't require them to be discerning about where they're at. So it doesn't allow for people to understand whether they should meet you where you're at as a yoga teacher. So I've been thinking a lot about that because you say, oh, I was told to teach everyone all the time as much as possible. And this happened to me then. I was in a space where I was teaching people from age 20 to 65. And those people didn't have the language to talk about their abilities or what their needs were. And I had no understanding of how to modify or make changes to a practice to accommodate for those needs coming out of a vinyasa teacher training. And it wasn't until, probably I was put through the fire a few times before I really started to realize that there's a choice you have to make. Like, who do you want to learn more about? What populations do you want to get clearer on and how to practice and teach with? And I still think that advice goes out to new yoga teachers. And I just feel like that's terrible advice.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I do think like you're essentially saying just go teach whoever, whenever, whatever, and you'll be successful. I don't think it works. I mean, when you try to build an action plan for that, it's not going to work. That's interesting though. I'm going to ask you about the podcast again. Yoga is Dead. Season 2 was announced, I think, a couple of months ago, right? And I remember hounding both of you on Instagram, like, I think in 2019, like, are you going to do season 2? Are you going to do season 2? You've got to do season 2. So, can you tell us anything about season 2? Is it going to be 6 episodes again? Will it be the same format, or you're going to make me wait till December 31st?
We don't know a whole lot.
Yeah. And you're not alone. It's not you that we're making wait. It's everybody. I think what we can share about season 2 is that our process is going to be different than season 1. Season 1, we jumped into the deep end and we constantly found ourselves like swimming to the surface to catch a breath of air. And like Jesal was saying, we had to essentially throw out some of the stuff we did, re-record, duplicate our efforts in a lot of places in the process of refining what we wanted to offer. Season 2, I think we're a lot more settled in terms of what we want to offer. And we're grounded in that so that we are so grounded that we're able to make changes that feel new and more interesting and might feel like refreshing what we've done. So I think our process is going to be a little different because it's going to be a lot more methodical and slower. And that actually comes from this dismantling mindset, dismantling quantity over quality. Like before, I had told you we sat for 8 hours and we had this target. We were going to record 2 episodes in 8 hours. And sometimes that worked out and sometimes that didn't. But then we did this funny thing where we would put a timeline out to the universe and people would then be expecting something from us. And it's a lot harder to pull back from that once we've already put it out there. So this time around, I think the lessons learned are that, take your time to make sure we're happy with the quality that we're putting together and putting out there so that we're not trying to claw back some things and then falling into that same pit of recording over something, revising something, when we could be just methodical and slower about it on the upfront part of it. And that's not something that we thought was really available to us. I think we thought we have this great idea. Let's put episodes out once a month without even realizing what it took to
which was so unrealistic of us. I mean,
Yeah.
we didn't even meet that at all.
Yeah. Actually, we did, right? We did meet it, but it was kind of to our detriment, like we felt a little more exhausted than we would have liked. We kind of rushed in places that we might not have wanted to. And going forward, we're having really good planning conversations where that's going to hopefully change.
Okay. Okay. Just so you know, like even though you re-recorded it and you did it twice and you spent 8 hours, I mean, we can't tell. When I look at your podcast, it is so organized. And I just had to say this in the interview for anybody listening, right? You should go check out the resources section on the Yoga is Dead website. I mean, the amount of time, effort, and organization that you put into it, it's amazing. None of anything that you're saying in terms of organization chaos, none of that comes through. Comes across as structured and really well thought out, just so you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it was well thought out, and it was obviously really well researched in that, and that's part of the process. Like, we're not doing an interview style, right? Where we're just not just, but it's a very different formatting to interview somebody. It's in the interview, you're trying to mine something out of like somebody's story and like tell a narrative through what somebody's experience is. Here, these are like big topics, and we're diving deep into them. And it requires so much time researching and so much time parsing through our own perspective, because you don't just come out the gate having an opinion. And let's be honest, our opinions have changed since putting out the episodes. Maybe not 180 degrees, but we've evolved. We've thought about things differently. Like, it's in the conversation amongst different colleagues and different viewpoints and different perspectives. We continue to gain more insight. So, coming to a point in time in an episode, it's just exactly that, a point in time, an opinion in time. And so how do you decide what that's going to be, even if you're not fully convinced, right? And I'm not saying like one of us isn't convinced, but we often don't have the same opinion, which is what I think makes the podcast so great too. But in the Vinyasa episode, we have very different conclusions because we don't have the same opinion. And I can bet you that if Tejal and I spend like 10 more hours talking about that topic, we'd be much more on the same page. But we didn't have those 10 hours to talk about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. So true. And do you know when season 2 is dropping? Like, I'm going to ask you, no, like do you have a date in mind? Because you guys said 2021. I'm not going to let you off the hook here, you see.
Here's
Like,
what we know. Okay, I'll tell you what we know. That a few ideas have emerged out of like experience and that make us really feel excited. And it's not yet even a full-fledged series of ideas.
okay, fair enough.
It is like a couple of ideas that were like, yes, this makes me excited enough. I think it's important enough to put out into the world as an industry for us to start talking about. So how are we going to flesh out this season? We don't know. When is it going to happen? We don't know.
Okay. I got my answers right there.
Yeah. That's it. That's what we know at this point. And we also know that like through the community support, we're able to get a little bit more help this time, because the first time we didn't have a lot of help and we had no idea how other people do things. And now we've talked to like colleagues and we're like, oh, you have somebody managing all this stuff. Like, great, like good. Now we can focus on the content. So yeah, hopefully we refine the process and make it even better so that we can be more focused on delivering what we want to deliver.
Perfect. I mean, I can't wait. I really can't wait. I'm really excited that you guys decided to do season 2. Before we wrap things up here, I want to play a little game with the two of you. Okay, think of this as rapid fire. I'm going to get Tejal to go first, and then we'll get to Jesal. So, Tejal, I'm just going to ask you this or that kind of questions, and you either pick or you respond with the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay, it is lunchtime here, so some of them are revolving around food. You'll notice there are several of those. Okay, so
good. I'm hungry too, so that should be easy.
perfect. So let's do this. Okay, Tejal, let's go. Parathas or biryani?
Parathas.
Coffee or chai?
Chai.
Gulab jamun or rasgulla?
Oh, rasgulla.
Huh. Would you wear a sari or a ghagra?
As I age, I'm more inclined to say sari.
Who do you like better, Shah Rukh Khan or Hrithik Roshan?
Shah Rukh, 100%.
Me too. Me too. Yoga at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m.?
Ooh, 5 a.m., but that's not realistic. I just like the idea of it.
Okay. Favorite Bollywood movie?
Oh, this is funny. It's either Devdas or Kuch Kuch Hota Hai.
Oh, two extremes. I wouldn't have. Okay, okay. If you could have one superpower, what would that be?
I love this question. It would be to, yeah, oh, I'm drawing a blank, but I actually have an answer for this. This is so funny. If I
I
had,
can come back to you. I can.
sure, you can come back.
That's
Not
fine.
really
This
rapid
one,
fire though. Sorry, I
yeah,
ruined
we
the
can come
game.
back to it. Jesal, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's. Pakodas or samosas?
Pakoras.
Ha. Parathas or biryani?
Paratas.
Coffee or chai?
Coffee every day, chai on special occasions.
Ah, okay. Gulab jamun or rasgulla?
Gulab jamun.
Auto rickshaw ride or a train journey in India?
Rickshaw. The thrill of almost falling out.
Oh, I love a rickshaw ride. I mean, idlis or dosas?
Dosas.
Head massage, like the tel malish type of thing, or a foot massage?
Head malish.
Favorite Bollywood movie?
DDLJ. Come on. I was like,
Oh
what is this?
yeah,
Devdas
yeah,
nonsense. DDLJ.
yeah. You know, I have to agree with Jesal on this one.
Oh, 4 hours to spare.
If you could dance to a Bollywood song, what song would that be?
Oh gosh. Oh my god. And I'm not even up to date on my Bollywood music.
It's okay. I mean, I love the 90s and the 80s and everything else.
I don't know. It has to be one of those like funny party songs, I think.
Okay. Okay.
I
And
can't
if
think of
you,
them right now.
Sheila.
Yeah, I love that song. Sheila Ki Javani. Why not?
so Tejal, you're picking Sheila Ki Javani for Jesal.
I don't know.
For Jesal, yeah.
And Jesal, do you want to pick one for her?
For Tejal, I can't think of them right now, but I'll come back.
Okay.
Here's the thing though. I feel like for weddings I've danced to most of them. So
Oh yeah.
the
Yes.
desire has been fulfilled. Next wedding I'll fulfill whatever desire.
Last one for you, Jesal. If you could have one superpower, what would that be?
To stop time for everyone except myself. So I have more
Oh.
time.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Interesting. Tejal, do you have a superpower that you thought of?
Mine is somewhere along the lines of having everyone's needs be met. Like if that could be a superpower of mine, I would just let's all be in a happier place.
Okay. Okay. I mean, it's your superpower. It can be whatever you want.
Okay, I thought of a song.
Okay, go
I
ahead.
really like that song. Oof, Teri Ada. I like the
Oh,
way
yeah,
you
yeah,
move.
yeah.
Right?
I know
Such a
that
good
one.
song.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to sing because I don't sing well, but I like that song and that is a
Neither
good
do
one.
I, but I don't know. Still felt the need to sing it.
Perfect. This has been so fun. I mean, I could talk to you both for like another hour and more easily. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Jesal, where can people find you? I mean, I think everybody knows who the two of you are, but just in case someone listening has been living under a rock, where can someone find you?
Yeah, you can find both of us at Yoga is Dead podcast on Instagram. That's like our main hub. We also have a Twitter, which is at Yoga is Dead. We have a website, www.yogaisdeadpodcast.com. And I think that's most of the Yoga is Dead ways. You can contact me individually at Yogawala with 2 L's. And same with my website. It's Yogawala, but there's an NYC. So it's yogawalanyc.com.
And Tejal?
Yep, mine is pretty easy at Tejal Yoga for Instagram. My Facebook's Tejal Yoga. My Twitter's Tejal Yoga. My website's tejalyoga.com. And you can find me there, and you can also reserve space in some of the meditations I offer too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I will make sure to link all of that in the show notes. This has been so fun. I look forward to talking to both of you again soon. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As always, thanks for tuning in. Please remember to review, rate, and share this podcast with your friends. Until next week, take care. Bye-bye.